They called him England's greatest hero. The Duke of Ashworth had returned from the Great War with medals gleaming on his chest and the nation's gratitude echoing in every toast. But Eleanor Hartley, the physician's daughter who had once known him as simply Alexander, saw what others refused to see. Behind the rigid posture and practiced smiles, she recognized the tremor in his hands, the way he flinched at sudden sounds, the haunted shadows that flickered across his eyes when he thought no one was watching. And on the night of his grand homecoming ball, when he disappeared into the darkened gardens, she followed. What she discovered there would shatter the carefully constructed facade of Britain's most celebrated war hero. If you are listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The autumn of 1919 brought Alexander Thornton, the 7th Duke of Ashworth, back to English soil with all the ceremony befitting a decorated war hero. The newspapers had chronicled his exploits in France with breathless admiration, each headline more effusive than the last. "The Duke, who held the line at Passchendaele," proclaimed the Times. "Ashworth's courage saves battalion," declared the Daily Mail. For 4 years, his name had become synonymous with British valor, a beacon of hope for a nation that had lost far too many of its sons to the mud and blood of the Western Front. Ashworth Manor stood as it had for 3 centuries, its honey-coloured stone glowing in the pale October sunlight, its manicured gardens stretching toward ancient oak groves. The estate encompassed 12,000 acres of prime Yorkshire countryside, and the manor itself housed 47 rooms, each appointed with the accumulated treasures of generations. It was here that Alexander had been raised, groomed from birth to assume the responsibilities of his title. It was here that he had learned to ride, to shoot, to command. And it was here that he had left behind a young man of 23, eager to serve king and country. The man who returned at 27 bore little resemblance to that idealistic youth, though few seemed to notice. Eleanor Hartley watched the preparations for the Duke's homecoming from the library windows of her father's modest house on the estate's eastern boundary. Dr. James Hartley had served as the Ashworth family physician for 30 years, and Eleanor had grown up playing in the same gardens where she now observed servants erecting silk pavilions and stringing paper lanterns. She had known Alexander Thornton before he became the Duke, before the war, before everything changed. "You're wool-gathering again, Ellie," her father remarked, entering the library with his medical bag. At 62, Dr. Hartley remained vigorous, his mind sharp, despite the silver threading through his dark hair. "The Duke's homecoming has you distracted." "I'm simply curious," Eleanor replied, though her tone suggested deeper concerns. At 24, she had inherited her father's keen observational skills and his dedication to medicine. She had spent the war years assisting him, treating the wounded soldiers who had been sent to convalesce at Ashworth Manor's converted East Wing. She had seen what war did to men, had dressed their wounds both visible and invisible. "The newspapers make him sound like Achilles returned from Troy." "The nation needs heroes," her father said gently. "After 4 years of horror, they need to believe that something good came from all that sacrifice." Eleanor turned from the window, her grey eyes troubled. "But what if the hero they're celebrating doesn't exist? What if the man who returned is someone quite different from the legend they've created?" Dr. Hartley studied his daughter with concern. Eleanor had always possessed an uncomfortable talent for perceiving truths that others preferred to ignore. "The Duke has invited us to tonight's ball," he said, changing the subject. "It would be ungracious to refuse." "Of course," Eleanor agreed, though something in her chest tightened at the prospect. The ballroom at Ashworth Manor that evening blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers. The guest list included everyone of consequence within 50 miles, members of Parliament who had made the journey from London, and several high-ranking military officers who had served with the Duke. The air thrummed with conversation and laughter, with the clink of champagne glasses and the rustle of silk gowns. Alexander stood near the marble fireplace, resplendent in his dress uniform, accepting congratulations with practiced grace. He was tall, with the broad shoulders and lean build of a man accustomed to physical exertion. His dark hair, though military short, showed a tendency to wave. His features were aristocratic, all sharp angles and classical proportions. But it was his eyes that had once distinguished him. They had been warm, intelligent, quick to light with humor or enthusiasm. Now they were carefully blank, revealing nothing. Eleanor observed him from across the room, noting details that others missed. The way he kept his back to the wall, the manner in which his gaze constantly scanned the crowd, as though cataloguing potential threats, the tension in his jaw, the rigidity of his posture, most tellingly, the way he held his champagne glass in his left hand because his right hand trembled too noticeably when not occupied. "The Duke appears in excellent health," Lady Pemberton remarked to her companion, loudly enough for half the room to hear. "So strong, so vital, not at all like some of these poor broken boys one sees hobbling about on crutches." Eleanor's fingers tightened on her own glass. Lady Pemberton's son had returned from the war minus his left leg below the knee. That she could speak so callously about broken boys, while her own son struggled with his new reality, revealed a willful blindness that Eleanor found almost obscene. "Miss Hartley." The voice at her elbow made her turn. Major Geoffrey Carstairs stood there, impeccable in his uniform, his handsome face arranged in a charming smile. He had served with Alexander in France and had returned home with a distinguished service order and no visible injuries. "You're looking as lovely as ever. That shade of blue suits you." Eleanor glanced down at her gown, a simple affair of midnight blue silk that her modest income had allowed. "Thank you, Major. I trust you're finding civilian life agreeable." "Oh, absolutely," Carstairs replied, though something flickered across his expression. "Though I confess, I miss the clarity of military life. Peacetime society can seem rather frivolous after what we've experienced." "Yet you seem to navigate it with ease," Eleanor observed. Carstairs laughed, a sound that carried no genuine mirth. "One learns to wear masks, Miss Hartley. It's what civilization demands." Before Eleanor could respond, a ripple of movement drew their attention. Alexander was making his way through the crowd toward them, his progress slowed by well-wishers who insisted on shaking his hand, clapping his shoulder, offering their admiration. "Hartley," Alexander said when he finally reached them, addressing Eleanor's father with genuine warmth. "Good of you to come." And Eleanor, his gaze settled on her, and for just an instant the careful mask slipped. She saw recognition there, memory, something almost like relief. Then it was gone, replaced by courteous formality. "You've grown up." "4 years will do that," she replied softly. "Welcome home, Your Grace." "Alexander," he corrected, his voice dropping slightly. "You used to call me Alexander." "That was before," Eleanor said. "Before you became England's greatest hero." Something dark moved behind his eyes. "Heroes are made in newspaper offices, not on battlefields," he said quietly. Then, louder, for the benefit of those around them, "I understand you assisted your father throughout the war, Miss Hartley, that you were invaluable in treating our wounded soldiers." "I did what I could," Eleanor replied, "though I fear it was never enough." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Eleanor saw the truth he was hiding. She saw the weight of memory, the burden of survival, the cost of being the man who lived when so many had died. She saw the cracks in his armor, the fault lines running through the hero's facade, and Alexander saw that she saw. He stepped back slightly, his expression closing. "If you'll excuse me, I should attend to my other guests." He moved away, disappearing into the crowd with the efficiency of a man executing a tactical withdrawal. "Curious," Major Carstairs murmured. "The Duke seems rather uncomfortable with all this celebration." "Perhaps he has reason to be," Eleanor said. The evening progressed with toasts and speeches, with dancing and elaborate dinner courses. Alexander performed his role flawlessly, playing the part of the grateful hero returned to claim his rightful place in society. But Eleanor watched him throughout, and she saw the moments when the mask slipped. the way he startled when a champagne cork popped loudly, the manner in which he positioned himself with clear sight lines to all exits, the increasing tension in his shoulders as the night wore on. Near midnight, she saw him slip away through the French doors that led to the terrace. Eleanor waited precisely 5 minutes before following. The October night carried a sharp chill, and Eleanor drew her shawl closer as she stepped onto the terrace. The sounds of the ball faded behind her, replaced by the whisper of wind through the garden's ancient oaks. Paper lanterns swayed along the paths, casting dancing shadows across manicured hedges and marble statuary. She found Alexander in the rose garden, standing perfectly still among the autumn blooms, his face tilted toward the sky. The moonlight illuminated his features with stark clarity, revealing what the ballroom's flattering candlelight had concealed. He looked haggard, carved from exhaustion and something darker. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Eleanor said softly, not wanting to startle him. He didn't turn. "Neither should you, Miss Hartley. It's not proper for an unmarried young woman to wander garden paths unchaperoned." "I've never been particularly concerned with propriety," she replied, moving closer. "And you're avoiding the question. Why aren't you inside enjoying your own celebration?" "Because I can't breathe in there." The words came out raw, unguarded. "Because every toast, every handshake, every congratulation feels like a lie." He finally turned to face her, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. "Do you know what they're celebrating, Eleanor? They're celebrating the fact that I survived while better men died. They're raising glasses to victory when the only thing we won was the right to count our dead." Eleanor moved closer, her medical training overriding social convention. "Your right hand," she said quietly. "The tremor. How long has that been occurring?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "It's nothing. Fatigue." "It's not nothing, and we both know it." She reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away. When he didn't, she took his right hand in both of hers. The tremor was pronounced, a fine shaking that spoke of nerve damage or profound psychological trauma. "Let me help you." "There's no help for what's wrong with me," Alexander said, but he didn't withdraw his hand. "I've seen 3 doctors in London. They've given me pills that make me sleep but bring nightmares. They've recommended rest, fresh air, positive thinking." His laugh was bitter. "They've suggested I simply choose not to think about it." "Then they're fools," Eleanor said flatly. She guided him to a nearby bench, sitting beside him while maintaining her gentle hold on his hand. "The tremor is worse when you're under stress, isn't it? When there are loud noises, crowds, expectations." "Yes." The admission seemed to cost him. "And the nightmares. How often?" Alexander was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Every night. Sometimes I'm back in the trenches watching men drown in mud, unable to reach them. Sometimes I'm at Passchendaele, and the bombardment never stops. Sometimes I'm giving orders that I know will send good men to their deaths, and I give them anyway because that's what command requires." Eleanor's throat tightened with grief for what he had endured, but she kept her voice steady. "What happened to make them call you a hero?" "Nothing heroic," Alexander replied. "Nothing glorious or noble. My battalion was trapped, German forces advancing, artillery raining down. I made a decision. We held a position that should have been abandoned. 73 men died following my orders. But we held long enough for the rest of the division to retreat safely. 1,400 men survived because 73 died." He pulled his hand free, burying his face in his palms. "They gave me medals for it. They write about my courage, my leadership. But all I did was choose who would live and who would die." "You made an impossible decision in an impossible situation," Eleanor said. "That's not heroism, perhaps, but it is sacrifice. It is duty." "Is it?" Alexander looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "Or is it simply the mathematics of survival? I calculate deaths, Eleanor. I weigh lives against tactical advantages. That's what they trained me to do, what the war made me into. And now I'm supposed to return to society, to take my place as the Duke, to marry appropriately, and produce heirs and pretend that I'm still the man I was. He stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the garden path. But I'm not. That man died in France. What came back is something else entirely. Eleanor rose and moved to stand beside him. Then perhaps the question isn't how to become who you were, but how to live with who you are now. And if who I am now is broken. The vulnerability in his voice was almost unbearable. If the tremor never stops, if the nightmares never end, if I can never again be in a crowded room without feeling like the walls are closing in, then you find ways to manage, Eleanor said firmly. You find people who understand, who won't demand that you pretend to be whole when you're not. You give yourself time to heal, and you accept that healing doesn't mean erasing what happened. Alexander turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time that evening. How did you become so wise, Ellie? 4 years of treating wounded soldiers, she replied. 4 years of watching young men struggle with injuries that no one else wanted to acknowledge. The war didn't just break bodies, Alexander. It broke minds and spirits, and society wants to pretend that if the body is intact, everything else will simply mend itself with time. She held his gaze. But that's not how trauma works. Trauma, Alexander repeated the word as though testing its weight. The doctors in London wouldn't use that term. They called it shell shock, war neurosis, functional nervous disorder, clinical terms that distance themselves from the reality. What do you call it? Eleanor asked. Cowardice, Alexander said quietly. Weakness, failure of will. No! Eleanor's voice was sharp. That's what people who have never experienced war call it. That's what comfortable civilians say from the safety of their drawing rooms. But it's not weakness to be changed by witnessing horrors. It's not cowardice to struggle with memories of atrocities. She stepped closer, forcing him to maintain eye contact. You are not weak, Alexander Thornton. You are wounded, and wounds can heal if properly treated. For a moment, Alexander simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, something in him seemed to break open. I can't sleep without whiskey, he confessed. I can't shake hands without worrying that someone will notice the tremor. I can't hear thunder without remembering artillery. I can't smell certain chemicals without being transported back to the aftermath of a gas attack. His voice cracked. And I can't tell anyone any of this because the Duke of Ashworth is supposed to be strong, supposed to be a leader, supposed to be the hero they need me to be. Then don't be the Duke right now, Eleanor said softly. Just be Alexander. Just be a man who survived something terrible and is trying to find his way forward. The dam broke. Alexander's carefully maintained composure shattered, and he turned away, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Eleanor did what instinct and compassion demanded. She stepped close and wrapped her arms around him, holding him while he finally let himself grieve. They stood there for long minutes, the sounds of the celebration drifting faintly from the manor, while Alexander wept for his dead, for his shattered illusions, for the innocence he could never reclaim. Eleanor held him through it all, offering silent support, asking nothing in return. When the storm passed, Alexander pulled back, roughly wiping his eyes. I apologize, he began, but Eleanor cut him off. Don't you dare apologize for being human, she said firmly. Don't you dare apologize for having feelings, for acknowledging pain. She pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve and handed it to him. You've spent months, years probably, holding everything inside, being strong for everyone else. You're allowed to break down. Alexander took the handkerchief, studying it rather than meeting her eyes. It was plain white linen, practical rather than decorative, embroidered with her initials in simple blue thread. You're extraordinary. Do you know that? He said quietly. Most women of our acquaintance would have run screaming or fainted. Most women of our acquaintance have never had to help amputate a leg or hold a dying boy's hand while he called for his mother, Eleanor replied matter-of-factly. War changes everyone, Alexander, not just the soldiers. He looked up then, really seeing her perhaps for the first time since his return. Eleanor Hartley had always been pretty in a quiet way, with her grey eyes and chestnut hair, But there was a strength in her features now, a knowledge in her gaze that spoke of hard-won wisdom. She stood before him in her modest blue gown, her shawl slightly askew, her expression filled with determination and compassion in equal measure. "What do I do?" Alexander asked, and the question contained everything. What do I do with these nightmares? What do I do with this guilt? What do I do with a life I never expected to have? "You start by being honest," Eleanor said. "Not with everyone, but with people you trust. You acknowledge that recovery takes time. You accept that you don't have to be perfect, don't have to have all the answers." She paused, then added carefully, "And you consider that perhaps the life everyone expects you to live isn't the life you need." "Cryptic advice, Miss Hartley," Alexander said, a ghost of humor touching his voice. "Practical advice, Your Grace," she corrected. "There are expectations pressing in on you from every side. Your position, your title, your duty to the estate. But what do you want? What does Alexander want, regardless of what the Duke of Ashworth is supposed to do?" The question hung between them, profound in its simplicity. Before Alexander could answer, the sound of footsteps on gravel made them both turn. Major Carstairs appeared on the path, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace, they're asking for you inside," he said smoothly. "Your aunt wishes to make a toast." Alexander straightened, and Eleanor watched as he reassembled his armor, piece by piece. The vulnerable man who had wept in her arms disappeared, replaced by the Duke, by the war hero, by the mask society demanded. His expression smoothed, his posture corrected, his voice steadied. "Of course," Alexander said. "Tell them I'll be there momentarily." Carstairs bowed slightly and departed. Alexander turned back to Eleanor, and she saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between duty and desperate need. "Go," she said gently. "But Alexander, this isn't over. We will talk again." "Why?" he asked. "Why are you willing to involve yourself with someone as damaged as I am?" Eleanor smiled, sad and knowing. "Because someone has to see the truth beneath the uniform. Because you deserve more than hollow praise and empty hero worship. And because—" She hesitated, then forged ahead. "Because I remember who you were before the war, and I believe that person still exists, somewhere inside the man you've become." Alexander reached out and gently squeezed her hand, his tremor evident even in that simple gesture. "Thank you, Ellie, for seeing me, for not looking away." Then he was gone, striding back toward the manor and the celebration awaiting him, leaving Eleanor alone in the rose garden with the weight of his confession and the knowledge that Alexander Thornton, Duke of Ashworth, war hero and national treasure, was slowly breaking apart, and no one but her seemed to notice or care. The morning after the ball dawned grey and drizzling, perfectly matching Eleanor's mood. She sat at the breakfast table, nursing her tea while her father read the morning newspapers. The headlines, predictably, were effusive in their praise of the previous night's festivities. "Duke's triumphant return, celebrated by county's elite," proclaimed the Yorkshire Post. There was even a photograph, grainy but recognizable, showing Alexander in his dress uniform, the picture of aristocratic dignity. Eleanor thought of the man weeping in the rose garden, and felt a surge of protective anger toward everyone who had contributed to building this impossible facade. "You were gone for quite some time last night," Dr. Hartley observed, lowering his newspaper to study his daughter. "I trust everything is well." "I spoke with the Duke," Eleanor replied carefully. "He's not well, Father. Not at all." Dr. Hartley set down his paper entirely. "Physically?" "Psychologically," Eleanor clarified. "Severe anxiety, nightmares, hand tremors, what they're calling shell shock, though I think the condition goes deeper than that term suggests." She met her father's concerned gaze. "He's struggling, and everyone around him is so invested in the hero narrative that they can't see he's suffering." "Shell shock is a controversial diagnosis," her father said carefully. "Many in the medical community believe it indicates a fundamental weakness of character. Then many in the medical community are fools, Eleanor said flatly. Father, I've seen it firsthand. Strong men, brave men, reduced to shaking wrecks by memories they can't escape. That's not weakness. That's the human mind pushed beyond its limits. Dr. Hartley was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. You're right, of course. I've seen it too, though I confess I don't understand it as well as perhaps I should. He paused. What do you intend to do? Help him, if he'll let me, Eleanor replied. Someone needs to. Be careful, Ellie, her father warned gently. The Duke occupies a very different social sphere than ours. Involving yourself in his troubles could have consequences. I'm aware, Eleanor said. I'm also aware that if no one helps him, those troubles will likely destroy him. 3 days later, a letter arrived, delivered by a footman in the Ashworth livery. Eleanor recognized Alexander's handwriting immediately, though it was less steady than she remembered from before the war. Miss Hartley, it began formally, I wonder if you might call at the manor this afternoon at 3 o'clock. There is a matter I should like to discuss with you, if you can spare the time. Yours respectfully, Ashworth. Eleanor arrived at precisely 3 o'clock, admitted by the butler and led not to one of the manor's formal reception rooms, but to Alexander's private study. It was a masculine space, lined with books, dominated by a massive oak desk, its windows overlooking the estate's western gardens. Alexander stood by those windows, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the rain-soaked landscape. Thank you for coming, he said without turning. I wasn't certain you would. I said we would talk again, Eleanor replied, removing her damp cloak. I meant it. Alexander finally turned to face her, and Eleanor was struck by how much more exhausted he appeared than he had at the ball. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his right hand was shoved into his pocket, no doubt to conceal its tremor. I've been thinking about what you said, Alexander began, about being honest, about accepting that recovery takes time, about finding people who understand. He paused, clearly struggling with vulnerability. I should like to engage your services, Miss Hartley. Professionally. Eleanor blinked in surprise. Professionally. I'm not a physician, Your Grace. I'm merely my father's assistant. You have more practical experience treating traumatized soldiers than most qualified doctors in London, Alexander countered. You understand what I'm experiencing because you've witnessed it firsthand. He moved to his desk, withdrawing a document. I'm prepared to compensate you handsomely for your time and discretion. I need someone I can speak honestly with, someone who won't judge or attempt to cure me with platitudes. Eleanor studied him carefully. What exactly are you proposing? Regular meetings, Alexander said, here, where we won't be observed or interrupted. You would act as a sort of medical consultant, helping me develop strategies to manage the symptoms, offering a perspective grounded in reality rather than social convention. His expression grew almost desperate. I cannot continue as I am, Eleanor. The nightmares are worsening. The anxiety makes even simple social obligations feel insurmountable. I need help, but I cannot seek it openly without destroying the carefully maintained image everyone depends upon. The image of the heroic Duke, Eleanor said quietly. Precisely. Alexander's voice was bitter. My aunt, Lady Catherine, is already planning a series of social events designed to reintegrate me into society and, not incidentally, parade me before every eligible young woman of appropriate breeding within 100 miles. My responsibilities to the estate demand attention I can barely muster, and all the while I'm expected to be strong, decisive, the man everyone believes me to be. He looked at her with raw honesty. I'm drowning, Ellie. I need someone to throw me a rope. Eleanor considered carefully. What Alexander was proposing was unconventional, potentially scandalous if discovered. But she had meant what she said in the rose garden. Someone needed to see the truth beneath the uniform. Someone needed to help. Very well, she said, but not as a paid consultant, as a friend, and with conditions. Name them, Alexander said immediately. First, you must be completely honest with me, even when that honesty is uncomfortable or painful. Second, you must follow any recommendations I make regarding your treatment, even if they challenge you. Third, we approach this systematically, keeping detailed records of symptoms, triggers, progress, or setbacks. Eleanor paused. And fourth, you must accept that I'm doing this because I choose to, not because you're paying me. This cannot be a transaction. It must be a partnership. Alexander studied her for a long moment, something like wonder crossing his features. Most people don't push back when a duke offers them money. I'm not most people, Eleanor replied simply. Do we have an agreement? We do. Alexander extended his right hand, tremor and all. Eleanor took it firmly, sealing their pact with a handshake that acknowledged his condition without pitying it. They settled into chairs near the fire, and Eleanor produced a small notebook from her bag. Let's begin with the basics, she said, her tone professional despite the informal setting. Tell me about your sleep patterns. What followed was the first of what would become regular afternoon sessions. Alexander described his symptoms in detail, his nights plagued by nightmares so vivid that he often woke unsure of whether he was in Yorkshire or France. He explained the triggers he had identified: sudden loud noises, the smell of certain chemicals, crowded rooms with limited exits. He confessed to using alcohol as a sedative, though he recognized it was becoming a problematic crutch. Eleanor listened without judgment, taking meticulous notes, asking clarifying questions. She had him demonstrate the tremor, observing its patterns and intensity. She inquired about his appetite, his energy levels, his ability to concentrate. It's worse in social situations, Alexander admitted. When I'm alone or with people I trust, like you or Carstairs, the symptoms ease somewhat. But at formal events, dinner parties, anywhere I'm expected to perform the role of the Duke, everything intensifies. That's consistent with anxiety, Eleanor observed. Your mind perceives those situations as threatening, even if rationally you know they're not. The tremor, the hypervigilance, those are your body's way of preparing for danger. She looked up from her notes. We need to find ways to help your mind recognize that you're safe now, that the war is over. But is it? Alexander asked quietly. The war may have ended officially, but it never ends in here. He tapped his temple. Every night I'm back there. Every loud noise returns me to the trenches. How do I convince my mind that it's over when it still feels so present? Gradually, Eleanor said, with patience and practice. There are techniques we can try. Breathing exercises to manage the physical symptoms of anxiety, controlled exposure to certain triggers, perhaps finding productive ways to channel the experiences you can't forget. She hesitated, then added, have you considered writing about it? Not for publication necessarily, but as a way of processing what you witnessed. Alexander looked skeptical. War memoirs are already flooding the market. Everyone wants to read about the glorious heroism, the noble sacrifice. I'm not suggesting you write propaganda, Eleanor clarified. I'm suggesting you write the truth, for yourself, not for public consumption. A way of taking the memories that torment you and giving them form, structure, containment. She leaned forward slightly. Right now, those memories own you. They come when they choose, unbidden and uncontrolled. Writing might give you some sense of agency over them. I wouldn't know where to begin, Alexander admitted. Begin with what haunts you most, Eleanor suggested gently. Give it words, make it concrete. Take away some of its power to lurk in shadows. They talked for 2 hours, far longer than Eleanor had anticipated. But as the afternoon wore on, she saw some of the tension ease from Alexander's shoulders, saw the tremor in his hand lessen slightly. Simply being able to speak honestly, to be heard without judgment, seemed to provide genuine relief. I should let you go, Alexander said finally, glancing at the darkening windows. I've monopolized your afternoon unforgivably. Nonsense, Eleanor replied, gathering her things. This is important work, Alexander, far more important than the social calls I'd otherwise be making. As she prepared to leave, Alexander said quietly, My aunt is hosting a dinner party next week. 12 guests, mostly neighbors and family friends. The thought of it makes me want to lock myself in this study and refuse to emerge. Then let's develop a strategy, Eleanor said practically. We'll identify the potential triggers, create coping mechanisms, perhaps even arrange for some subtle support. She smiled slightly. You're not alone in this, remember. We're partners now. Alexander's expression softened with genuine gratitude. I don't know what I did to deserve your help, Ellie, but I'm profoundly grateful for it. You don't have to deserve help, Eleanor replied firmly. You simply have to be willing to accept it. Over the following weeks, their afternoon sessions became a fixed point in both their routines. Eleanor would arrive at 3 o'clock, they would talk for hours, and slowly, incrementally, Alexander began to show signs of improvement. The nightmares continued, but he learned breathing techniques that helped him manage the panic upon waking. The tremor persisted, but he developed strategies for minimizing its visibility. The anxiety remained, but he grew better at recognizing and addressing its onset. More importantly, the isolation that had been crushing him began to lift. In Eleanor, he had found someone with whom he could be wholly himself, someone who demanded neither heroism nor perfection, someone who saw his wounds and did not flinch. For Eleanor, the work was both challenging and deeply meaningful. She was helping someone in genuine need, applying knowledge she had gained through difficult experience. But she was also, though she tried not to acknowledge it, falling rather hopelessly in love with the complex, wounded, fiercely intelligent man who trusted her with his broken pieces. One afternoon in late November, as bare tree branches scratched at the study windows and the fire crackled warmly, Alexander set down the tea he'd been drinking and said, "I've started writing about Passchendaele." Eleanor looked up from the journal where she'd been noting his progress. "How is it?" "Agonizing," Alexander admitted, "but also clarifying. You were right. Giving it form, structure, words, it makes it feel less overwhelming somehow." He paused. "Would you read it? I'd value your perspective." "I'd be honored," Eleanor said softly. Alexander retrieved a leather-bound journal from his desk drawer, its pages covered with his unsteady handwriting. He handed it to Eleanor with visible reluctance, as though parting with something precious and painful. Eleanor opened to the first page and began to read. The account was raw, unflinching, describing the mud and blood of Passchendaele with terrible clarity. It spoke of men drowning in shell craters filled with water, of the constant shriek of artillery, of the decisions that haunted him. But it also contained moments of profound humanity. Soldiers sharing cigarettes, singing songs from home, displaying courage that had nothing to do with glory and everything to do with surviving another day, another hour, another minute. "This is extraordinary," Eleanor said when she finished, her eyes damp with unshed tears. "Alexander, this is important. This is the truth about war that needs to be told." "It's too honest," Alexander said. "Too ugly. People don't want to read this. They want heroism and triumph." "Some people want the comfortable lie," Eleanor agreed, "but others need the truth. The soldiers who survived, who are struggling as you struggle, they need to know they're not alone." She held his gaze. "You could give them that. You could use your voice, your position, to speak for those who can't speak for themselves." "You're suggesting I become some sort of advocate?" Alexander looked both intrigued and apprehensive. "I'm suggesting you consider that perhaps your experiences, painful as they are, might have purpose," Eleanor replied. "That perhaps helping others who suffer as you suffer might also help you heal." The idea took root slowly, but it took root nonetheless. And as November gave way to December, as the anniversary of the armistice approached, Alexander began to contemplate what it might mean to be more than just the celebrated hero, to perhaps become something more useful, a voice for the wounded, a champion for those whom society would rather forget. And through it all, Eleanor remained his constant, his anchor, the person who saw him completely and chose to stay. December brought unexpected challenges to Alexander's carefully balanced recovery. Lady Catherine Thornton, his formidable aunt and the manor's long-standing social arbiter, arrived from London with plans that threatened to upend the fragile stability he had achieved. Over breakfast one morning, she announced her intentions with characteristic directness. "I've invited the Pembridge family for Christmas," Lady Catherine declared, spreading marmalade on her toast with precise movements. She was a handsome woman of 57, dressed impeccably even at 8 in the morning, her steel-grey hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure. "Lord Pembridge and I have corresponded extensively, and we agree that an alliance between our families would be most advantageous." Alexander set down his coffee cup carefully. "An alliance? Don't be obtuse, Alexander. His daughter, Lady Arabella Pembridge, is 21, accomplished, beautiful, and from one of England's oldest families. She would make an ideal Duchess of Ashworth." Lady Catherine's expression brooked no argument. "You're 27 now. It's past time you married and secured the succession." "I've been home less than 2 months," Alexander protested. "Yes, and you've spent that time hiding in your study rather than attending to your responsibilities," Lady Catherine replied crisply. "This manor requires a mistress, the estate needs an heir, and society expects you to fulfill your duty. The Pembridges arrive in a fortnight. I trust you'll make an effort to be cordial." That afternoon, Alexander recounted the conversation to Eleanor with barely suppressed frustration. They sat in their usual places in his study, though the tension radiating from him was palpable. "My aunt has decided to marry me off like a prize stallion," he said bitterly. "Never mind that I can barely manage a dinner party without having a panic attack. Never mind that the idea of intimate partnership with anyone feels impossible when I can't even explain what's wrong with me." Eleanor kept her voice carefully neutral, though her heart had plummeted at his words. "You're not obligated to marry anyone you don't choose to marry." "Aren't I?" Alexander countered. "I'm the Duke. The estate, the title, the responsibilities. They all demand heirs. My aunt isn't wrong about that." He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "And Lady Arabella is, by all accounts, perfectly suitable. Beautiful, refined, everything a duchess should be." "But," Eleanor prompted gently, "but she'll want the Duke, won't she? The war hero, the man of strength and certainty. She'll want someone whole." Alexander's voice dropped. "And I can't be that person. I don't know if I'll ever be that person again." Eleanor set aside her notebook, abandoning professional detachment. "Then you explain that to her. You're honest about your struggles. And if she can't accept you as you are, then she's not the right person, regardless of her pedigree." "It's not that simple," Alexander said. "The Pembridges are one of the wealthiest families in England. An alliance would strengthen Ashworth's position considerably. My aunt has already begun planning the engagement announcement." He looked at Eleanor with something like desperation. "How do I refuse without seeming ungrateful or impossible?" "You don't refuse outright," Eleanor suggested. "You meet Lady Arabella. You assess whether there's genuine compatibility, and you remember that your well-being matters more than social convenience." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Marriage to someone who doesn't understand your struggles, who expects you to be someone you're not, would be its own form of prison." "Worse than being alone?" Alexander asked quietly. "Much worse," Eleanor confirmed. "At least alone. You can be yourself." The fortnight passed too quickly. The Pembridges arrived with appropriate fanfare. Lord Pembridge, a distinguished man in his 60s, his wife, a nervous woman who seemed perpetually worried about appearances, and their daughter, Lady Arabella, who was indeed everything Lady Catherine had promised. She was beautiful in a classical way, with golden hair arranged in perfect waves, porcelain skin, and cornflower blue eyes. Her manners were impeccable, her conversation polished, her accomplishments numerous. She was also, Eleanor observed during the welcome dinner, utterly devoid of genuine warmth or curiosity. "The Duke's war service must have been terribly exciting," Lady Arabella said over the fish course, her tone suggesting she was discussing a particularly thrilling sporting event. I've read all the newspaper accounts. So brave, so heroic. War is rarely exciting, Lady Arabella, Alexander replied carefully. Mostly it's exhausting and frightening, and deeply unpleasant. Oh, but surely the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, she pressed, seemingly oblivious to his discomfort. The newspapers say... The newspapers romanticize horror, Alexander interrupted, his voice tight. I'd prefer not to discuss it if you don't mind. An awkward silence fell. Lady Pemberton, sitting beside Eleanor, filled it with forced brightness. The Duke is simply being modest. We all know of his extraordinary courage at Passchendaele. Eleanor watched Alexander's jaw clench, saw his right hand grip his fork with white-knuckled intensity. Under the table, his leg was bouncing rapidly, a sign she'd learned indicated rising anxiety. If this continued, he would bolt or break down, and either would be catastrophic for his carefully maintained image. Lady Arabella, Eleanor interjected smoothly, I understand you're an accomplished pianist. Have you had the opportunity to play the Manners Broadwood? It's a magnificent instrument. Lady Arabella turned to Eleanor as though noticing her for the first time. I wasn't aware we had been introduced. Miss Eleanor Hartley, Eleanor supplied. My father is the estate physician. Ah. The single syllable conveyed volumes about Lady Arabella's opinion of Eleanor's social status. How quaint. She turned back to Alexander, dismissing Eleanor entirely. Your Grace, I should very much like to see your military decorations. Papa says you received the Victoria Cross. I did, Alexander said shortly. It's in a drawer somewhere. Lady Arabella laughed as though he'd made an amusing joke. The Duke is so modest, she told the table generally. Of course, a man of his stature can afford to be modest. His accomplishments speak for themselves. Eleanor saw Alexander's composure fracturing, saw the tremor beginning in his hand despite his efforts to control it. She made a quick decision. Your Grace, I believe you promised to show me those medical texts in the library, she said, rising from her seat, for my father's research. Perhaps now would be a convenient time? Alexander seized the lifeline gratefully. Of course, Miss Hartley. If you'll excuse us, he directed toward the table already standing. Lady Catherine looked displeased, but propriety demanded she allow the departure. As Eleanor and Alexander left the dining room, Eleanor heard Lady Arabella ask, with barely concealed cattiness, Why on earth is the physician's daughter dining with us? Because she's invaluable to this household, Lady Catherine replied crisply, surprising Eleanor. More invaluable than you might imagine, Lady Arabella. In the library, Alexander collapsed into a chair, breathing hard. I can't do this, he said. I cannot marry that woman, Ellie. She doesn't see me. She sees a uniform and medals and newspaper headlines. Then you tell your aunt no, Eleanor said firmly, kneeling beside his chair. You don't sacrifice yourself on the altar of social expectation, not after everything you've already sacrificed. My aunt will be furious, Alexander said. The Pembridge alliance means a great deal to her. Your aunt will survive, Eleanor countered. The question is, will you? Because marrying Lady Arabella while you're still struggling with trauma, while you need understanding and support rather than performance and appearances, that would destroy you. Alexander looked at her with raw vulnerability. You make it sound simple. It is simple, Eleanor replied. Not easy, but simple. You deserve to be with someone who sees you, who accepts your struggles, who doesn't demand that you be the mythical hero. She held his gaze. You deserve to be loved for who you are, Alexander, not for who the newspapers claim you to be. Something shifted in Alexander's expression, a recognition dawning there. Ellie, he began, but she stood quickly, cutting him off. Focus on getting through this dinner party, she said, retreating to professional distance. We'll develop strategies for the remaining days of the Pembridge visit. Then you can have the difficult conversation with your aunt. The following days were a delicate dance. Alexander fulfilled his obligations as host while maintaining careful boundaries. Lady Arabella, sensing his lack of enthusiasm, increased her efforts, becoming more cloying and less authentic with each passing hour. Lord Pembridge began to look concerned. while Lady Catherine's frustration grew increasingly visible. Eleanor observed it all from her position at the margins, offering Alexander support during their afternoon sessions and strategic advice for navigating social obligations. But she was acutely aware of Lady Arabella's hostility, of the way the younger woman's eyes narrowed whenever she saw Alexander and Eleanor in conversation. The breaking point came on the Pembridge family's final evening. Lady Catherine had organized an elaborate dinner, followed by dancing in the ballroom. The gathering included neighbors and local gentry, a showcase of Ashworth's social prominence and Alexander's eligibility. Lady Arabella, resplendent in a gown of cream silk and diamonds, positioned herself firmly at Alexander's side. Eleanor, relegated to the far end of the room with the lesser guests, watched with growing concern as Alexander's tension visibly increased. The crowd, the noise, the expectations, all the triggers they'd worked so carefully to manage were present in force. When the dancing began and Lady Arabella claimed Alexander for the first waltz, Eleanor saw the strain in his expression, the rigid set of his shoulders. Halfway through the dance, it happened. The orchestra's crescendo, reminiscent of artillery thunder, proved too much. Alexander's control shattered. The tremor became pronounced, his breathing rapid and shallow. In the middle of the ballroom floor, surrounded by spectators, England's great war hero froze, panic overwhelming him. The music faltered. Guests stared. Lady Arabella pulled back with an expression of confusion and dawning revulsion. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She crossed the ballroom floor rapidly, ignoring social convention entirely. "Your Grace," she said calmly, taking his arm with firm confidence, "I believe you're needed urgently in the study, a matter requiring immediate attention." Alexander latched onto her presence like a drowning man grasping a rope. He allowed her to guide him from the ballroom, through the corridor into his study. Behind them she heard the whispers beginning, the speculation and gossip that would spread like wildfire. She didn't care. In the study, Alexander collapsed onto the sofa, his breathing still ragged, his hand trembling violently. Eleanor knelt before him, taking both his hands in hers. "Look at me," she commanded gently. "Focus on my voice. You're safe. You're here, in your study, in Yorkshire. The war is over. You're safe." She repeated the words like a mantra, keeping her voice steady and calm, holding his gaze until gradually, slowly, his breathing eased, his panic subsided. When he could speak again, his voice was hoarse. "I've destroyed everything," he said. "Lady Arabella, my aunt's plans, my reputation. Everyone will know now. Everyone will know I'm broken." "Good," Eleanor said fiercely. "Let them know. Let them see the truth instead of the comfortable lie." She squeezed his hands. "You are not broken, Alexander. You are wounded, and you are done pretending otherwise." The door opened. Lady Catherine stood there, her expression unreadable. Behind her, Eleanor could see Major Carstairs. "The Pembridge family has departed," Lady Catherine said carefully. Somewhat abruptly, Lady Arabella was disturbed by what she witnessed. "Then she was never right for him," Eleanor said before Alexander could respond, rising to face the older woman with surprising authority. "He needs understanding, not judgment. Support, not performance. If Lady Arabella couldn't provide that, then it's fortunate her unsuitability was revealed now rather than after an engagement." Lady Catherine studied Eleanor for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, she nodded. "You may be right, Miss Hartley." She looked at her nephew with concern that seemed genuine. "Alexander, I had no idea you were struggling so profoundly. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because everyone needs me to be strong," Alexander said tiredly. "Everyone needs the hero." "I need my nephew to be well," Lady Catherine replied firmly. "The rest can wait." She glanced at Eleanor, then back to Alexander. "I believe you found an extraordinary ally, Alexander. Don't be foolish enough to let her go." With that cryptic statement, she departed, closing the door behind her. Alexander and Eleanor sat in silence for a moment. Then Alexander said quietly, "She's right, you know. about you being extraordinary, about me being a fool if I let you go. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Ellie, these past weeks, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope, the belief that I might eventually be more than my wounds. He paused. But I've also come to realize that what I feel for you goes beyond gratitude. Eleanor's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. Alexander, I love you, he said simply. I love your strength, your compassion, your refusal to accept comfortable lies. I love that you see me completely and choose to stay. I love you, Ellie, and I have no right to ask this. But, he took a shaky breath, could you imagine a future with someone as damaged as I am? Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but she smiled through them. You foolish man, she said softly. I've loved you since before the war. I've loved you through your suffering and your struggle. And yes, Alexander, I can imagine a future with you, not despite your wounds, but with them, because they're part of who you are now. The relief that flooded Alexander's face was almost painful to witness. Then you'll stay? You'll help me find my way forward? Always, Eleanor promised. But Alexander, we need to be clear about what this means. Your social circle will be horrified. A duke marrying a physician's daughter, that's perfectly acceptable, Alexander interrupted firmly, because it's what I choose, what we choose together. He stood, pulling her up with him. I'm done living according to other people's expectations, Ellie. The war taught me that life is too short, too precious, to waste on pretense. I want to build something real, something honest, with you. Eleanor looked at this complex, wounded, extraordinary man who had somehow chosen her, and felt hope bloom in her chest like the first spring flowers after a brutal winter. Then we build it together, she said, one day at a time. Alexander drew her close, resting his forehead against hers. One day at a time, he agreed, starting now. The scandal, when it broke, was spectacular. Within days, all of Yorkshire society knew that the Duke of Ashworth had suffered some form of collapse during his engagement ball, that the Pembridge alliance had dissolved in chaos, and most shockingly, that His Grace was being treated by the physician's daughter rather than consulting reputable specialists in London. The gossip mills churned with speculation, much of it unflattering. They're saying you've had a nervous breakdown, Major Carstairs reported during a morning visit in late December. He sat in Alexander's study, reviewing the latest newspaper accounts with poorly concealed distaste. That you're unstable, potentially dangerous. The Times published a letter yesterday from a retired general suggesting you should relinquish your seat in the House of Lords until you've recovered your moral fortitude. Moral fortitude, Alexander repeated dryly. He appeared remarkably calm given the circumstances, his hand steady as he poured tea for Eleanor and Carstairs, because mental wounds are moral failings, apparently. It's absurd, Carstairs said vehemently. Anyone who was in France knows better. Half the men who came back are struggling in similar ways, but society would rather blame individual weakness than acknowledge that war breaks people. He glanced at Eleanor apologetically. Present company accepted, of course, Miss Hartley. No apology necessary, Eleanor replied. You're absolutely right. Society finds it easier to pathologize trauma than to confront its causes. She looked at Alexander. Which is precisely why we need to control the narrative before it destroys you completely. What did you have in mind? Alexander asked. Eleanor leaned forward, her expression determined. You write an honest account of your experiences. Not just the war itself, but the aftermath. The nightmares, the anxiety, the difficulty of returning to normal life. You put a human face on what they're calling shell shock, and you use your position to advocate for better understanding and treatment of wounded soldiers. You're suggesting I publicly confess to mental fragility, Alexander said slowly. That would be social suicide. Or it would be revolutionary, Carstairs interjected, surprising them both. The Duke of Ashworth, war hero and Victoria Cross recipient, speaking openly about psychological wounds. That would give thousands of suffering men permission to acknowledge their own struggles. It would challenge the narrative that equates trauma with weakness. He set down his teacup decisively. I think Miss Hartley is right. Control the story, or let the story control you. Alexander looked between them, considering. Finally, he nodded. Very well, I'll write it. But Ellie, I'll need your help shaping it, making sure it's both honest and useful. Of course, Eleanor agreed. We'll work on it together. Over the following weeks, Alexander threw himself into the project with an intensity that surprised even Eleanor. He wrote for hours each day, pouring his experiences onto paper with raw honesty. He described Passchendaele in unflinching detail, but also the internal landscape of his recovery, the nightmares that shattered sleep, the panic that made simple social interactions feel impossible, the guilt that shadowed every moment of survival. Eleanor read each draft, offering feedback that helped him balance vulnerability with dignity, honesty with utility. They debated phrasing, discussed which details served the greater purpose, considered how to make his experience accessible without sensationalizing it. This section, Eleanor said one afternoon in January, pointing to a passage about his first panic attack after returning home. You're apologizing again. I know I should be stronger. Don't apologize. State the experience factually. Let readers draw their own conclusions. Alexander revised the passage, strengthening it. You're ruthless as an editor, he observed with affection. I'm invested in this succeeding, Eleanor replied. What you're doing, Alexander, it matters. It could genuinely help people. As they worked, their personal relationship deepened. Alexander had proposed formally on Christmas Day, presenting Eleanor with his grandmother's ring, a simple sapphire that suited her far better than ostentatious diamonds would have. They had decided to wait until spring to marry, giving Alexander time to stabilize further and allowing them to navigate the social complications their union would inevitably create. Lady Catherine, to her credit, had embraced the engagement with genuine warmth. Miss Hartley has been better for you than a dozen London physicians, she'd told Alexander. I was wrong to push the Pembridge match. You need someone with substance, not simply breeding. Doctor. Hartley had given his blessing with visible pride, though he'd cautioned his daughter about the challenges ahead. You'll be a duchess, Ellie, but you'll never be fully accepted by some in that world. Are you prepared for that? I'm prepared to stand beside the man I love, Eleanor had replied simply. The rest is secondary. By February, Alexander's account was complete. Beneath the uniform, A Soldier's Return, was 40,000 words of unflinching honesty about war trauma and its aftermath. At Eleanor's suggestion, they included a section written by Dr. Hartley, providing medical context for shell shock and describing treatment approaches that had shown promise. Carstairs contributed a foreword, validating Alexander's experiences from a fellow soldier's perspective. The question became where to publish it. Traditional publishers were hesitant, uncomfortable with such raw disclosure from a peer of the realm. Finally, Carstairs suggested The Lancet, the prestigious medical journal, as a special supplement focused on war injuries and their treatment. It positions your account as medical testimony rather than social scandal, Carstairs explained. It gives it credibility and purpose. The Lancet agreed enthusiastically. In March 1920, Beneath the Uniform was published in full, accompanied by sympathetic editorial commentary from the journal's editors. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters poured in from soldiers and their families, expressing gratitude for Alexander's honesty, sharing their own struggles, requesting advice. Medical professionals debated the account in journals and conferences, some using it as evidence for the need for specialized trauma treatment, others defending traditional views of shell shock as moral weakness. The newspapers, predictably, were divided. Conservative publications condemned Alexander's disclosure as unbecoming and damaging to military morale. Progressive papers championed his courage in speaking openly. The controversy kept beneath the uniform in the public conversation for weeks. More importantly, the account changed the national discussion around war trauma. Soldiers who had been suffering in silence found their experiences validated. Families gained understanding of what their loved ones were enduring. Organizations dedicated to veteran welfare began incorporating psychological support into their services. "You've started a movement," Eleanor told Alexander one evening as they reviewed the latest batch of correspondence. "Whether you intended to or not." "We started it," Alexander corrected. "None of this would exist without you, Ellie. Your insight, your encouragement, your editing, this is our work together." "Then let's continue it," Eleanor suggested. "What if Ashworth Manor became a place of treatment and recovery? We have the space, the resources. We could establish a program specifically for soldiers struggling with trauma, offering both medical treatment and practical support." Alexander's eyes lit with genuine enthusiasm, the first she'd seen since before the war. A veterans' sanctuary, a place where soldiers could be honest about their wounds without judgment. "Exactly," Eleanor confirmed. "Your account opened the conversation. Now we provide practical solutions." They spent weeks developing the concept, consulting with Dr. Hartley about medical requirements, with Carstairs about what soldiers actually needed, with Lady Catherine about how to structure the program socially and financially. By April, they had a comprehensive plan for the Ashworth Veterans Recovery Program, which would offer 6-month residential treatment combining medical care, occupational therapy, and psychological support. "You're taking the worst experience of your life and transforming it into something healing," Eleanor said, as they finalized the proposal. "That's extraordinary, Alexander. I'm simply trying to ensure that others don't have to suffer as I did, in silence and isolation," Alexander replied. "If my position and my experiences can create something useful, then perhaps there was purpose in my survival after all." The first patients arrived in May, 10 soldiers, all suffering from what was now being called post-traumatic neurosis, all referred by military hospitals that had found themselves unable to provide adequate care. Ashworth Manor's East Wing was converted into comfortable accommodations, treatment rooms, and communal spaces. Dr. Hartley supervised medical care, while Eleanor coordinated daily activities and therapeutic interventions. Alexander participated fully, sharing his own experiences, offering understanding that could only come from having walked the same difficult path. The transformation in Alexander himself was remarkable. Having purpose, being able to channel his trauma into helping others, provided the meaning he'd been searching for since his return. The nightmares diminished in frequency and intensity. The tremor, while never completely disappearing, became manageable. The anxiety lessened as he gained confidence in his new role. "You've found your mission," Carstairs observed during a visit to inspect the program. "Not as a soldier, but as an advocate. It suits you, Ashworth." "It gives me reason to wake each morning," Alexander agreed. "That's been in short supply since armistice." The wedding, when it finally occurred in June, was small by ducal standards. Family, close friends, the veterans currently in residence at Ashworth Manor. Eleanor wore a simple gown of ivory silk. Alexander, his dress uniform, the medals he'd once hidden now worn with acceptance rather than shame. They exchanged vows in the manor's chapel, promising partnership, honesty, and mutual support through whatever challenges lay ahead. Lady Catherine wept, though whether from joy or relief or some combination, Eleanor couldn't determine. Dr. Hartley gave his daughter away with visible pride. Carstairs served as best man, delivering a toast that balanced humor with genuine affection. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when one of the veterans, a young man named Thomas, who had arrived barely able to speak about his experiences, stood to offer his own toast. Your Grace," he began, addressing both Alexander and Eleanor. "You've given us something precious. You've given us permission to be broken and hope that we might eventually heal. You've shown us that admitting wounds isn't weakness, it's the first step towards strength." His voice wavered but held. "You've saved lives here not through military command but through compassion and understanding. I'm honored to witness this union, and I'm grateful beyond words for what you've both given me." The chapel erupted in applause. Eleanor saw tears on Alexander's face and felt her own eyes filling. This, she thought, this was what victory looked like. Not medals and parades and newspaper headlines, but one wounded man finding the courage to speak his truth, supported by a community that understood. As they left the chapel, walking through an honor guard of veterans who had become friends, Alexander leaned close to Eleanor and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me, for staying, for believing I could be more than my wounds." "Thank you for letting me," Eleanor replied, "for trusting me with your broken pieces, for building something beautiful from all that pain." They stepped into the June sunshine, ready to face whatever came next, together. September 1921 brought the changing leaves and the crisp promise of autumn to Ashworth Manor. Eleanor stood at the window of what had once been Alexander's private study, but now served as their shared office, watching the veterans in residence participate in the morning's therapeutic activities. 2 years had passed since that catastrophic engagement ball. 2 years since her world had tilted toward this unexpected future. The Ashworth Veterans Recovery Program had grown beyond their most optimistic projections. What had begun with 10 soldiers now accommodated 30 at a time, with a waiting list extending months into the future. The program's success had attracted attention from medical professionals across Britain and Europe, many of whom came to observe their methods. Dr. Hartley had trained 2 additional physicians specifically in trauma treatment, and Eleanor had developed a comprehensive therapeutic curriculum that other institutions were beginning to adopt. More importantly, they had a success rate that contradicted prevailing medical wisdom. 70% of their patients showed significant improvement within 6 months, able to return to productive lives with manageable symptoms. 30% achieved what Alexander had achieved, transformation of trauma into purpose, finding meaning in helping others navigate similar struggles. "You're thinking loudly again," Alexander said, entering the office with his characteristic quiet grace. At 29, he had grown into his role in ways neither of them had anticipated. The tremor in his hand persisted, though it no longer troubled him. The nightmares still came occasionally, but he had learned to manage them. More significantly, he had become one of Britain's most vocal advocates for veteran welfare, testifying before parliamentary committees, publishing extensively, using his position to effect genuine change. "I'm thinking about Thomas," Eleanor replied, turning from the window. "He leaves next week for Edinburgh. The university accepted him into their medical program." "Because you wrote him a letter of recommendation that could have qualified him for sainthood," Alexander said with amusement. He crossed to her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. It was a gesture of comfortable intimacy, the ease of partners who had navigated difficult terrain together. "You're proud of him." "I'm proud of all of them," Eleanor said. "But yes, Thomas especially. When he arrived here, he couldn't speak about his experiences without breaking down. Now he wants to become a psychiatrist specializing in trauma. That's extraordinary growth." "That's your influence," Alexander murmured. "You give them permission to transform pain into purpose." "We give them that permission," Eleanor corrected. "I couldn't do any of this without you, Alexander. Your willingness to be vulnerable, to share your struggles publicly, that created the foundation for everything we've built." They stood there for a moment, simply being together, watching the veterans below. Eleanor's hand moved unconsciously to her abdomen, where the slight swell of early pregnancy was just beginning to show. They hadn't announced it yet, wanting to wait until she was further along, but the knowledge filled her with quiet joy. "Have you finished the article for the Lancet?" she asked, redirecting to practical matters. "Nearly," Alexander replied. Carstairs contributed a section on his work with the London Veterans Organisation. I think it strengthens the argument considerably. He paused. There's been another development. The War Office has invited me to join a commission examining long-term care for wounded soldiers. They're finally acknowledging that psychological injuries require as much attention as physical ones. Because people like you refuse to be silent, Eleanor said. Because you made them confront uncomfortable truths. Because you refuse to let me hide, Alexander countered. Every step forward, every article published, every testimony given, that was possible because you saw the truth beneath the uniform and insisted I acknowledge it rather than concealing it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Lady Catherine entered, still formidable at 59, though her relationship with Eleanor had evolved into genuine affection and respect. I apologize for the interruption, but we have visitors. Lord and Lady Wentworth have arrived with their son, Captain Wentworth. They're inquiring about admission to the program. I'll meet with them, Eleanor said immediately. Initial consultations with prospective patients and their families had become her responsibility, as she had developed an instinct for assessing who would benefit from their approach and who required different interventions. The Wentworths waited in the drawing room, a middle-aged couple whose expensive clothing couldn't conceal their anxiety, and their son, a young man of perhaps 25, who sat rigidly, his eyes focused on nothing, his hands clenched in his lap. Captain Wentworth served in France, Lord Wentworth explained after introductions. He was decorated for valor, recommended for promotion, but since his return he's been unwell. Nightmares, violent outbursts, periods where he doesn't seem to recognize us. The man's voice cracked. The doctors in London have been useless. They prescribe rest and positivity, as though willpower could cure what's wrong with him. Then we read the Duke's account and we thought, perhaps there might be help here. Eleanor knelt before Captain Wentworth, positioning herself in his line of sight without crowding him. Captain, I'm Eleanor. Can you hear me? Can you tell me what you're experiencing? Slowly, painfully, the young man's eyes focused on her. It never stops, he whispered. In my head, it never stops. The shelling, the screams, the mud. I'm there constantly, even when I'm here. I can't make it stop. We won't promise to make it stop, Eleanor said gently, honestly, but we can teach you how to manage it, how to live alongside it rather than being consumed by it. That's what we do here. We help soldiers learn to survive the aftermath of war. She explained the program's structure, the 6-month residential period, the combination of medical treatment and therapeutic activities, the community of understanding that veterans built with each other. She was honest about the success rate, about the fact that some wounds never fully healed, but could be accommodated. The Duke himself, Lady Wentworth said hesitantly. The rumors say he suffered a breakdown. Is that true? The Duke experienced severe post-traumatic symptoms upon his return, Eleanor replied, choosing her words carefully. He still experiences some symptoms, but he's learned to manage them, to build a productive life despite them. He's living proof that psychological wounds don't have to define or destroy you. Could we speak with him? Lord Wentworth asked. It might help Richard to hear from someone who truly understands. Eleanor arranged it immediately. Alexander joined them, and for an hour he spoke with Captain Wentworth with the unflinching honesty that had become his trademark. He described his own struggles, his recovery process, the ongoing challenges he still faced. He made no promises but offered genuine hope grounded in reality rather than platitudes. By the time the Wentworths departed, Captain Wentworth had agreed to enter the program, and his parents were weeping with relief. That never gets easier, Alexander said after they'd gone, seeing myself reflected in their eyes, remembering how lost I felt. But you also give them something precious, Eleanor replied. You give them proof that recovery is possible. That's worth remembering. As autumn deepened toward winter, the rhythm of life at Ashworth Manor found its groove. Eleanor balanced her work with the program with preparations for the baby arriving in spring. Alexander continued his advocacy work while remaining intimately involved with the veterans in residence. Lady Catherine managed the social and administrative aspects of both the estate and the programme with characteristic efficiency. One November afternoon, a letter arrived that made them both pause. It was from Lady Arabella Pembridge, whom they hadn't heard from since that disastrous engagement attempt. "Dear Your Grace," it began formally, "I write to offer my apologies for my behaviour during my visit to Ashworth Manor 2 years past. I was young, foolish, and shamefully ignorant of the realities faced by those who served in the war. My brother has recently returned from service in India, struggling with difficulties similar to those you described in your published account. Through supporting him, I have come to understand how profoundly I misunderstood your situation. I wish you and your wife all happiness and commend the important work you are doing. With sincere contrition, Arabella Pembridge." "She's grown up," Eleanor observed, setting down the letter. "That took courage to write." "People can change," Alexander agreed. "Look at me. 2 years ago I was barely functional. Now I'm testifying before Parliament and running a treatment program." He pulled Eleanor close. "Because you refused to accept that trauma was destiny. Because you showed me that wounds could be healed, or at least accommodated." "We showed each other," Eleanor said. "I learned as much from you as you learned from me." Winter arrived with the first snow, blanketing the estate in white quiet. On Christmas Eve, the entire household gathered, family, staff, veterans, visiting medical professionals, for a celebration that felt more like community than formality. Thomas, preparing to depart for Edinburgh in the new year, played piano while others sang carols. Dr. Hartley engaged in animated discussion with the visiting physicians about emerging trauma treatment theories. Lady Catherine presided over everything with satisfaction, seeing the manor filled with purpose and life. Alexander and Eleanor slipped away at midnight, walking through the snow-covered gardens where they had first spoken honestly about his struggles. The bare branches overhead created intricate patterns against the starlit sky, and their breath misted in the cold air. 2 years ago, I stood in these gardens, wanting to disappear, Alexander said quietly. I couldn't imagine a future that didn't feel like torture, couldn't conceive of being happy again. He turned to face Eleanor, taking both her hands in his. You gave me that future, Ellie. You gave me back my life. You gave me purpose, Eleanor replied. A way to use everything I learned during the war, everything I witnessed. You gave me partnership, equality, the ability to create something meaningful. Her free hand moved to her abdomen. And now you're giving me family. They stood there in the silent garden, two people who had found each other in the aftermath of horror and built something beautiful from broken pieces. Around them, Ashworth Manor glowed with warm light, filled with soldiers finding their way back to themselves, supported by a community that understood that healing was not linear, that recovery took time, that wounds acknowledged could eventually transform into wisdom. I love you, Alexander said softly, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for refusing to accept the mask everyone else wanted me to wear, for being brave enough to look beneath the uniform. I love you, Eleanor replied, for trusting me with your broken pieces, for having the courage to be vulnerable, for transforming your pain into something that helps others. They kissed there in the snow, two scarred survivors who had found in each other not perfection, but perfect understanding, not completion, but complement. The war had broken them both in different ways, but together they had learned that breaking open could also mean breaking free, free from impossible expectations, from crushing pretense, from the prison of being who others demanded rather than who they truly were. And as they walked back toward the manor, toward warmth and community and the life they were building together, Eleanor thought about the journey from that catastrophic ball to this moment of peace. It hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks and struggles, days when Alexander backslid into darkness, moments when Eleanor doubted whether their work would succeed. But they had persisted. They had refused to accept that trauma was destiny, that wounds couldn't heal, that broken meant irredeemable. And in refusing to accept those limiting narratives, they had created something revolutionary. A place where soldiers could be honest about psychological injuries, where recovery was measured not by returning to who they were before, but by building new identities that accommodated what they'd survived. The future stretched before them, uncertain, but no longer frightening. There would be challenges ahead. Parenthood while maintaining the program, expanding their work while preserving its integrity, continuing to fight against societal stigma around mental health. But they would face those challenges together, with honesty and courage and the understanding that perfection was unnecessary when you had partnership. Spring brought the baby, a daughter they named Catherine Eleanor, for the two women who had shaped Alexander's recovery in different but essential ways. Spring also brought 20 new veterans to the program, a parliamentary commission recommending nationwide adoption of their treatment methods and international recognition of their pioneering work. But more than accolades or expansion, Spring brought Alexander standing in the garden at dawn, holding his daughter while the sun rose over Ashworth Estate. Eleanor watched from the window, seeing not the Duke or the war hero or the traumatized soldier, but simply a man who had survived impossible horrors and found his way to joy on the other side. He looked up, catching her watching, and smiled. The unguarded smile of someone who no longer needed masks, who had learned that true strength lay not in hiding wounds, but in the courage to heal them. And Eleanor smiled back, thinking of how far they'd traveled from that night in the Rose Garden when a broken soldier had finally allowed someone to see the scars he hid beneath the uniform. Those scars remained, would always remain, permanent marks of what he'd endured, but they no longer defined him. They were simply part of his story, woven into the tapestry of a life reclaimed, a purpose found, a love that saw everything and stayed. That, Eleanor thought, was the truest form of victory. Not the absence of wounds, but the refusal to let wounds become walls. Not the erasure of pain, but the transformation of pain into purpose. Not becoming who you were before trauma, but becoming who you needed to be after. Stronger in the broken places, wiser for the struggles, more compassionate for having suffered and survived. Alexander returned inside, placing their sleeping daughter carefully in her cradle before joining Eleanor by the window. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together watching the sun illuminate their world, the estate they managed, the soldiers they helped, the future they were building one honest, courageous day at a time. "Thank you," Alexander said quietly, "for not looking away." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, "for letting me see." And in that moment, in that simple exchange, lay everything they'd built and everything they would become. Two people who had learned that the deepest scars are often invisible, that true heroism sometimes looks like asking for help, and that love, real love, sees not just the polished surface, but the wounded humanity beneath. They had found each other in the darkness. Together, they had found the light. If you have been listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are listening. I want to know how far this story has traveled.